Welcome to my webcast, and thank you so much for coming. I'd like to start with a little bit of a story with a little company called Google. So a number of years ago, Google announced a new web browser that they were creating called Google Chrome. Now, back then, and even now, we really liked Google. Geeks loved Google, and Google loved Mozilla and Mozilla Firefox. In fact, they were so close that Mozilla had a Google Kitchen in their office. So they had a really good relationship going. And also around that time, it may be hard to remember now, but Firefox was the dominant browser, and really nobody was really questioning any problems with Firefox. We weren't going like, oh, why can't there be a better web browser? So with this great relationship that Google had going with Firefox, and then them announcing a new web browser out of the blue, a lot of us were left wondering, what is going on? Why would they do that? So Google released a white paper, and in it they described their reasons for doing a web browser. Here's an excerpt of one of those reasons. And they were describing a thing called asynchronous JavaScript execution. So you have once you have JavaScript executing, it's going to keep going, and the browser can't do anything else until JavaScript returns control to the browser. So developers write APIs that are asynchronous, and every now and then the browser locks up because JavaScript is hung up on something. Now, these are very technical reasons for creating Google Chrome browser. It wasn't about a better bookmarking system or a better UI. They created Chrome because they felt like the web would move forward faster if they moved forward with the underlying technology. And it was really difficult to explain this to the audience. So they created this white paper, but then they were also concerned that not enough people would really read it. So what they did is they had Scott McCloud, who's the author of Understanding Comics and sort of considered to be the godfather of comics, come into the office and interview the team, the engineers, the designers, the product managers. And then he drew a story about what he had learned from it. And so this is the results. And you can see here, this is one of the engineers explaining the same snippet that I had just shown you. And here is one of the frames that really describes that particular passage that I was sharing, where the browser is a personified thing, and there's this little JavaScript going away and essentially explaining that the browser is just going to say, go off and do your thing. I'm just going to be here, and I'm going to continue doing my stuff until you're back. When I interviewed the product marketer at the time, Anna Christina Douglas at Google, and asked her why she chose to use comics to communicate this, she said comics let us illustrate what was really happening with the technology in an abstract and digestible way. If we just had a white paper, very few people would have read it. And if you recall from that time, it was a very innovative piece of marketing and communication. In fact, they released it just prior to the browser's release. So even more people were very interested in looking at it and understanding why Google was releasing Google Chrome and learning more about it. And they did find that a lot more people had read the comic than the white paper. So this is what I'm going to talk about today is how to get your ideas across with storyboards. And I'm going to use the term storyboards and comics pretty interchangeably. I think that storyboards have been a little bit overloaded in the design world to mean a number of different things, where sometimes they refer to a set of UI flows. In today's webinar, I'm going to be talking about storyboards as a way of communicating a story, and I'll use the word comics interchangeably. If you want to get in touch with me during this talk or afterwards, my Twitter handle is @K, and you can find my email on my blog, kevinol.com, or my book, seewhatimean.org. So normally I do this sort of workshop in person, and what I ask people to do is to actually have pen and paper with them. Given that I can't see you. I'm not going to be able to make sure that you do. But if you want to follow along, there are some places where I encourage you to have a pen and paper. Don't worry, the drawing requirements are very, very low, and in fact, it's to show you that. All right, so I'd like to start off actually by talking about the properties of comics. Why is it that I think comics are a particularly interesting medium for us? And I really think of it as 4 different areas that are interesting: communication, imagination, expression, and motion. So start with communication. Comics are really, actually a really, really old form of communication. Before even words, comics really, in a way, symbols and hieroglyphics have been the basis upon which words come from, upon which alphabets are formed. And if you think of comics as a form of sequential art, which is what Will Eisner, author of a book called Comics and Sequential Art, defines comics as, it's a sequence of art which tell a story. So comics are this really base form of language. And you can see an example of this here. This is when I was back at Yahoo, my design manager, Tom Wales, and he had this T-shirt. And you look at this T-shirt, and you immediately know what this dog is doing. So I said to Tom, "Wow, that shirt's really funny. That's cool." And he goes, "Yeah, you know what's really funny is I have this 2-year-old son, and he understands what this dog is doing, and he's never read a comic book in his life. But every time he sees this, he's cracking up, and I can tell he knows exactly what that dog is doing." And I was explaining to Tom that that's not really that surprising. Unlike words, the language of comics is this visceral, universal language that's understood by all languages and has this sort of very intuitive meaning to it. When you look at images like this, you can see the alarm clock is moving through the motion lines. You can see the little speech bubble means it's making sounds. Squiggly lines mean the person is angry. Little symbols or angry scribbles make it clear that the person is thinking angry thoughts. And so there's elements of the comic vocabulary that's just completely universal. And if you are familiar with comic books such as Asterix or Tintin, which have literally been translated into hundreds of languages, the reason that they translate so well is that so much of their story is communicated through this universal language. The second piece is imagination. So this is an example from the book I mentioned earlier, Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics. If you look on the far left, that is a picture of potentially anybody. It could represent anybody of any gender or age or nationality or ethnicity. But as you get into more and more detail on the right, it becomes less abstract. It becomes more definitive of who it is you're describing. And the advantage here is that when it's clear, when it's more abstracted away, it allows the reader either to put themselves into the context of the reader or even somebody that they know. And that abstraction is really good for engaging the audience. And you can use this to actually change what you want to be very clear about and what you want to be more abstract about. So this is a scene of the Golden Gate Bridge, but the character is more abstracted away, and you can put yourself into it. And you'll see this being used a lot, in particular in Japanese comics, where they put incredibly detailed backgrounds, but their characters have a lot less detail to them. So for those of us, as many of us are, I'm sure, in technology space, when we talk about this applying for technology, it actually can be applied to other aspects too. So this is a comic we use at Yahoo, where at first on the left side, we showed a search results page because this part of the story, the character was going to do a search and comes across the search results page. But actually, that wasn't really an important piece in terms of what was on the search results page, only that she was on it. And we found that the people reading the comic focused a lot on the details of that page. So we abstracted it away, and we showed only enough detail to really get that point across. So we showed that it was Yahoo Local, we showed that there's a search, and we showed that it was localized to Mountain View in California. But you could abstract it away even further and not even show the screen, and only show just enough UI to really get the point across that the person is doing some sort of selection, and even hand sketch that to really show, like, this is just to get the point across. It's not about the UI. It's about the context of what the person is doing around this product. The third piece is expression. So if you look at these words, these phrases, I'm sorry and thank you, they seem to be, they don't have a lot of difference in meaning. They're very clear in meaning. I'm sorry is apologetic and thank you is appreciative. We all know this. But actually, if you apply this to these frames, again from Will Eisner's book, these expressions, all of a sudden, these words have very different meaning, even though they're saying the same words. I'm sorry could be sarcastic, could be heartfelt. Similarly, it could be a thank you that's playful or really not meaning those words. So it's this combination of words and pictures that make more expressiveness in comics than either of the two alone. And you can see this, and the expression also comes out in the imagery of the people, the facial expressions, the body language. And of course, if you are familiar with Pixar movies like WALL-E, they're masters at expressiveness. And WALL-E has managed to show expression with just eyes a lot of times. Just the eyes of these characters convey so much about what is going on. Finally, the last property that I think make comics really interesting is motion. And I think this is the one that really has a lot of room to play with. So if you look at this picture here, it looks like a person that is jumping up and then coming back down. Pretty simple, but what happens if I just add nothing but blank space in between them? All of a sudden, it looks like the person is jumping up much, much higher, or perhaps he or she has been abducted by an alien and then returned much later. But so you can see, like, just adding blank space is creating more essence of time passing. Now you can say, well, this is maybe just, these are like animation frames, and each one of these represents the same unit of time. But what's really interesting with comics is even the size of the panel can make a difference. So this is one long panel, which sort of, through just the length of the panel, accentuates the time passage. And repetition could also be used to show time passage. To hear someone tapping into a search engine, perhaps, and then waiting for a while before something is returned. Maybe they have a slow internet connection. And then the context of the picture, of course, shows different time passage. And you can also show time passage through contextual things in the background, like clock. And this is a storyboard from the Matrix movie. So Matrix, the movie industry is a great example of one that uses storyboards to save on the cost of production by really sketching out what they're going to do before the expensive process of filming. So they hired Steve Skroce, who is a professional comic who's done things such as X-Men for Marvel, and he did these storyboards. And this is the dojo scene from Matrix. And you can see Neo doing a backflip here to avoid Morpheus. And it's not, when you look at this, it's not like you suddenly read this and go, oh, wow, Neo has learned to clone himself during this dojo scene. We understand from this that even though it's one panel and it's 4 replicas of Neo, it's an indication of motion and throughout the panel. So time is passing even within the single panel. There's all these really different ways to play with motion. So those are some of the interesting properties that I think make comics more interesting or powerful and unique from other mediums. Communication, it's a very powerful form of communication that a lot of people understand. Imagination, you can abstract away the details that you would prefer the reader to infer themselves. It's more expressive than words or pictures alone, and there are a lot of ways that you can play with motion. But perhaps the most important property of comics is that they're fun. They're just purely fun and really, really enjoyable for everyone to look at. All right, so the next part is, I mentioned that you need a pen and paper, and perhaps that would make some of you nervous. When it comes to storyboards, I think that you need very, very little to actually make use of storyboards yourselves and use this as a tool in your toolbox. So the question for all of you is, how many of you consider yourselves artists? So I'm going to submit my own answer here. And 73% of you are saying no. Now, when I ask this, even in design conferences, that ratio does not actually change that much. Here, let me quickly push full results. Yeah. That answer does not change that much, which might surprise you. There are people, I've been in a room of hundreds and hundreds of designers, and I would be lucky if a quarter of the people raise their hands. Now, why is this? I mean, you would think designers, of all people, would consider themselves artists. So there's a book by a man named Gordon McKenzie called Orbiting the Giant Hairball. It's about creativity in a large organization. And in it, he has an anecdote about how he goes to kindergartens and then elementary schools and asks this question. He's there to show them art, but he also asks them, where are the artists? And who of you are artists? And in kindergarten, everybody is raising their hand. They're reaching for the sky. And as he goes up in the grades, he asks the first grade how it's going. They go, there's like half the number of people. And then he goes to second grade, and there's maybe a few hands and a few very tentative hands, like maybe, I guess. So what's happening here? It's not as though between each grade there's an exam going on, and they're saying, like, okay, next time somebody asks you if you are an artist, you're not allowed to raise your hand any. There's some sort of societal pressure or understanding of what it means to be an artist. Like, you have to be paid for it, or you have to be above a certain level. And I would argue that if you can draw very basic shapes, if you can draw even a smiley face, if you can do any of these things that you tend to do when you were in kindergarten, when you drew houses and suns and smiley faces, you are an artist. And with basic shapes, as you know, you can draw a lot of things. So you can draw a smiley face or a frowny face, you are an artist, and you can make use of storyboards. So if you do have a pen and paper, I'd like you to try this. To draw a bunch of these faces, the circle, two dots, and these eyebrows, and then try filling in the mouths with different expressions, and see what you get. And you'll find that you can do a lot of different expressions. This is to that point earlier I said about expressiveness. So look at this here. So these are some attempts that I've made. You can see like a line, the shape of the line, adding teeth, adding a tongue, can drastically change the expression of the person. And it's very, very clear, the expression of the person. So actually the simplicity of the smiley face is an advantage because when you're reading the story, you know exactly the emotion that you're trying to get across. And now, if you're following along with pen and paper, draw this, where 2 dots and a single line for the mouth, and try playing around with the eyebrows. And do different shapes, do closeness to the eyes, different arches, things like that. And play with the symmetry and see what kind of expressions you can get. So here are some of the expressions that I did when I was playing around with this. So you can see like closeness to the eyes is like distrusting, and then there's anger, asymmetry. Asymmetry causes like a puzzling kind of expression. You can do furrowing eyebrows. There's a lot you can do with very, very little. Don't worry, I'm not going to go into like a full-blown drawing class here, but I'm going to share a few tips that my dad, who's an electrical engineer, taught this to me when I was like 5 or something like that, and it was possibly the best drawing lesson I ever got, which is how to draw a face. A lot of people make the mistake of putting eyes about a third of the way down from the head, and actually the way to draw a face is to do a cross that bisects an oval, that's the head, and then put the eyes there, and then split the bottom half into thirds, and that's where the nose and mouth go. What's really powerful about learning this little trick, this one trick, is that if you imagine this oval to be a ball, then you can move that cross around the ball and do the same rules in terms of putting where the eyes are and where the nose is and where the mouth is. And suddenly you can draw all sorts of faces facing any direction. It's an incredible tool. And of course, you learn rules in order to break them. So once you do know how to do this, you can then choose to exaggerate features and move off of the exact rules of the halves and things like that. There are similar rules for body proportions, though those tend to be less strict because body shapes, I think, vary much more. But generally speaking, you can use sort of the size of the head to measure 2 heads for the chest, a head for the hips, and 3 heads for the legs. But really, like I would worry less about that. What matters is if you can draw stick figures and if you can draw smiley faces, you can get a lot of stories across to talk about your products, your processes, use those to communicate with people internally for findings of a usability report or the new process or an instruction manual or marketing to customers. There's just all sorts of different things you can communicate. Or, of course, the one I use it most for, which is this is a new product or feature idea, and this is how people will be interacting with it. So stick figures, once you start drawing them, you'll find like the way the stick figure leans is very expressive. And as you get comfortable with these stick figures, if you want to, completely optional, you can treat those as a skeleton and add meat onto the skeleton to create real figures. And stick figures even come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. You can choose different types of bodies, and this is really completely about personal preference. You can use little balls for hands and feet, or not at all. Okay, so we know how to draw basic stick figures. We know how to draw smiley faces. How do we apply comics? How do we use storyboards within the context of an organization in order to what's the process we go through to create it? So in my book, I walk through a process which I found works really well within, at least for building comics, certainly related to products and features. So this process involves 4 steps. And as you get familiar with it, you may learn that certain steps are less necessary for you for different reasons, but it's a good guideline. So the first is to determine what your comic is about. Once you've what is it that you want to be talking about? What are you trying to highlight? Who is it for? This is probably one of the most important steps. The second step is scripting and writing the story out in words. And this is a very simple, this is a short process. It doesn't involve pages and pages, but it serves as a good guidepost before the next step, which is laying out the comic. And this is where you might iterate a lot and playing around with what works best. And then finally, if necessary, you may want to draw and refine it to something a little higher fidelity. A lot of times, I'll end on the third step, and the stick figures are sufficient for me. So I'm going to talk about each of these steps a little bit more. So the first step, what is the comic about? So when you're deciding what the comic is about, there are a few things you should think about. The goals of the comic, what are you trying to achieve? What do you want them to do? Do you want them to buy a product? Do you want them to understand a process better? Do you want them to learn, to be able to put together that bookshelf that they just bought from IKEA? Then you want, and just to be clear, these four things are not in a sequence. You just have to decide on these things, and it's not necessarily in this order or priority. Another thing you have to decide on is the length of the comic. Why would you choose a longer one versus a shorter one? Well, it depends on who you're giving it to and the time commitment you think that you have from them. So if they're just visiting your web page and from a search result or an ad, then you probably don't have a lot of time with them. On the other hand, somebody interested in why Google is releasing Google Chrome may have a little bit more investment, especially because their target was not to target all consumers with that comic, but people sort of with a slight, at least some level of technical understanding, which relates to the next point, which is who is this comic for? What is their context? What are their mental models? What is their expertise level? And then what is the use case that you want to be conveying to them? So if you're explaining a product, your product may do many, many different things, but you may want to just highlight and describe a few core use cases of using this product and why it's advantageous to use it. So some examples of this. This is a comic that I used at Raptor. This was on the homepage of Raptor, and it's a social gaming site. So we chose to use this short comic on the homepage of the site, and so we knew the attention span was short. Our goal was to get people to register, and I'll talk a little bit more later in terms of how well we succeeded in it. The Google Chrome comic I mentioned, they chose to do a longer length. In fact, the original intent was to only print printed booklets to certain bloggers and such to read. Then they eventually decided to release it digitally as well. This is a manga comic created by the US Navy, and it was from an aircraft carrier that was going to be docked at a Japanese port for a year, and they wanted to explain to Japanese why they were there, and so they came up with this idea to create this long-form Japanese manga comic to help them explain. And for those that don't know, comics or manga, which is the Japanese word for comics, is incredibly popular there, and you find it difficult to walk a city block without seeing somebody reading a comic. So they're read by people of all ages. So when they actually gave this out for free and released it, there was actually a line around the block to pick up a free copy of this manga. So they knew their audience, and they knew that this was the right medium, and they created a long-form comic for it. Just talking about use case a little bit and audience, I borrowed this example from, of course, Don Norman's Design of Everyday Things when he talks about mental models. So these are both illustrations of how to use how to use a camera, or rather how a camera works. So depending on whether this is an illustration for a textbook on optics, or a manual for the person who's bought a camera, the kind of illustrations and the kind of comic that you would create would be different. And then, you want to think about the use case and the story you want to tell. So, of course, Apple is fantastic at storytelling. So when they choose to create stories, in their case in video form, they don't talk about the resolution of FaceTime or the number of people you can chat with at a given time or things like that. They talk about, look, the use case around this product, which is these grandparents can see their newborn grandchild from across the country. So the second step, once you've decided how to create a comic, what your comic is about, is to script this out. I used Hollywood as an example earlier, and actually comics go through oftentimes a very similar process, especially when they have a separate writer from an artist, in that there is a script that looks very much like a Hollywood movie script. So the script, this is a script excerpt from a Harry Potter movie. So you can see interior of tent, late afternoon, Harry's pacing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a part of the Harry Potter movie. And when you break this down, there's a number of things happening here. There's the setting. There are the actions that are happening. There's the actors, and there's what the actors are saying, the dialogue. And each of these things are represented visually differently in the script to help people understand what's going on. But also, these are the things that you need to think about when you're creating a comic. So, for example, the setting. So if you ask somebody on the phone, where are you? There's a lot of different answers they can give. They can say, oh, I'm in a car, or I'm in a black Subaru, I'm on my way, almost there, I'm at this address. And so you need to decide which is actually the important piece of information that you want to convey to people when you're talking about where this comic is taking place, the setting. Is it indoors or outdoors? Is it a place of work or home? What kind of building is it? What city, what country, what time of day, what's the weather? What else is happening around there? Is it a noisy place? Are there lots of people? So these are the things you have to ask, and not all of these are important. And therefore, but the things that are important, you want to make sure that you convey early on. So, for example, here's two separate panels that both could be an opener for a comic. And one just has a cashier saying, that'll be $5. And the other is opening with also the cashier saying through the door, you can hear, that'll be $5, please. But it illustrates the person, the setting is at a coffee shop. So if it matters that it's a coffee shop, then you can do something like that. If it simply matters that a transaction is happening at a cash register, then the left one will be sufficient. Next, the dialogue. So dialogue is something that is one of the harder pieces to talk about. So this is again a comic from our Yahoo days, and we're talking. This was a product where the character could use maps and create his own maps. And so he says, man, there is so much to do in Downeyville that I will need to create several collections of points. So we showed this to a lot of potential users, this story, these comics, and they looked at this, and a lot of them were saying things like, wow, this George character, he must be, I think this comic was in relation to him creating this trip for his girlfriend. So people are like, wow, his girlfriend must really be mad at him because he's going through all this effort. And somebody else was like, wow, George is really anal. So unfortunately, we dubbed him henceforth Anal George. But the really important point of this is that the dialogue really matters in that we have to select really realistic dialogue that doesn't catch people and make people distracted from the story. And and that's something that you might have to iterate through. Another point about dialogue, or the words around it, are captions. Captions are the words that are around the comics, that are narrations describing the panel. Oftentimes, that would be a caption might be "Meanwhile in Gotham City." So sometimes we could use captions a little bit too extensively. So this is actually a comic from the Apple days, a long time ago. I think this was in the 90s. So this was from Lori Batelny, and you can see this proposed product they were talking about, which involves camera and memory cards. But when you look at it, it's talking about things like when his baby was born, and then he had to bring a digital camera home, sit down at the table, remove the flash card from the camera, what the tablet does in terms of turning itself on. So really, the illustrations are barely actually telling the story. Most of the story is being told in the captions. So what I would say when you're trying to do storyboards is actually focus on trying not to use captions as a crutch. And instead, if you're telling story, if you're explaining things too much in the narration, you should consider putting those into the pictures instead. So the third piece is laying out the comic. So when it comes to laying out the comic, the considerations are composition, perspective, and flow. So composition, so actually first, when I talk about laying out the comic, there's a lot of ways you can lay out the comic. You can put the characters anywhere. You can just basically have two stick figures talking through the entire time. But you can also make it much more interesting. So here's an example of comic that might be used to describe Shazam. Most of you are probably familiar with Shazam. You use it on a phone, and you can detect whatever song is playing in the background. So here's a comic that describes that. Oh, what's that song? Oh, I'll just use Shazam, and then discover what the song name is. So I could tell the same story, though, and change the angles and really make it just much more interesting. But even more so, I can also illustrate much more of what's going on by choosing different angles. So this is just an example of how important it is to figure out how best to lay out the comic. So when it comes to composition, there's a few things you can do. So the composition rules are really no different from photography or painting. The rule of thirds, for those of you familiar, is very helpful here. So split a panel into thirds, and instead of putting things in the middle, put them on one of the lines of the thirds, or even better, one of the intersection points of the thirds as the focal points. The other thing to consider in composition is leaving enough room for the words, so that people don't look cramped or there's not too much white space. So include the words first, and then add the characters. The perspective or the angle that you choose is also important. So if you think of a panel as though it was a camera angle, where you put that camera angle is can tell different things. So if you choose a camera angle that's 3/4 up, like the panel is labeled A here, you can see more of the scene, and if you were trying to illustrate what's going on in the scene, that works better. But if you want to be really close up to show expressions of a person, or just really emphasize something, or emphasize a screen on a phone or things like that, you might use a close-up. Using camera angles from below tends to put the reader more into the scene. So camera angles like C work. And the last part about laying out is to think about flow. So this is kind of a hypothetical comic where these two people are walking, and then suddenly there's a panel that's like a phone showing mom. And so it doesn't show really a connectivity. So you have to think about, like, what is that progression? How do people go from one panel to the next and understand what's going on. So here's another way you could show it. And this is the person walking along, and you show that the phone is ringing, and then you have them answering the phone. But even here, it's not perfect because all of a sudden the person is facing the other direction. And so you have to think about things like continuity of one thing cueing and leading to the next panel, but also the directions and keeping those together. Finally, the last step is refining and drawing and refining the comic. So as I said, this is really an optional piece, but I've talked a lot about how stick figures are sufficient, but actually there's a lot of great tools where even if you have no illustration training or background, you can create some higher fidelity comics. So again, here's Tom Wales. This is a trick that I've used since I was 5 and really haven't stopped. One of the best ways to learn is by imitation, and one of the best ways to learn to draw is to trace. So take pictures of the things you want to draw and then trace them. And that's a great way to create the comics that you want to create. Now, why trace them and not just use photos? Well, that's because if you use photos, and we've tried this before, where we took photos of people in different scenarios, and they're using the product, and then we create a comic out of that. And the problem with photo comics is while they're very easy to create, it's very distracting, especially if you're using them internally, to read a comic and be like, oh yeah, hey, there's Jane pretending to be a patron of a coffee shop. So tracing them allows you to do that whole abstracting away the details so that you can focus on the story instead. And you can also use a lot of tools out there like avatar generators to create the comics. So again, back when I was at Yahoo, another team were inspired by the comics process and decided that they would use Yahoo avatars to create comics. So they went to avatars like Yahoo and created these comics from the characters and backgrounds there. I went to explore it and tried it out and was surprised at the flexibility even back then. So I created different versions of myself. There's like Kevin and Skater Boy Kevin and Depressed New Yorker Kevin and Mac Daddy Kevin. So I was like, okay, that's really interesting. But what I quickly found is what happens if you don't have a background that you need or a character that you need. Then you're kind of stuck and you're constrained by the tool. And really, I would much rather that the story is the thing that owns and not the tool. Of course, you could use this as a starting point and then trace over it so that you can draw other things without using the templates. Here's another thing, a template that somebody created. This is Bryce Johnson's cute little toy templates where he posed all these toys to create a comic template on Flickr. So you can access that. By the way, all of these resources are, I do have a pinboard where I link a lot of these things at the end, and I'll share that with you guys. And you can also email me for any of these references. Anyways, this is a great resource. Again, the problem is if there are scenes that you need that's not represented here, that would be a problem. But I suppose you could get those toys and create even more scenes. I like this also because the characters are abstracted away. They're just smiley faces. There's another one here that's design comics that was created from Sun Microsystems. It's open source. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of templates that they created by hiring a professional artist. So this is a great resource. There's tons of different variations. One of the problems I have with this particular one is while there's a large number in terms of quantity, I do feel like it's a little bit too photorealistic, and the character expressions are a little bit difficult to differentiate in terms of what's happening and loses a little bit of that expressiveness that you get from comics. There's also tools available like this is Manga Studio. It's really a tool for professional manga artists, so it may be overkill for a lot of you. A little bit more casual of a tool is Comic Life. It's available for both PC and Mac. As you can see from their example, it's designed to be fun for making like family comics and things like that. You can drag photos or any images in there, so you can drag your drawings into there. But they have great tools for laying out and captioning and special effects and speech balloons. It's a really, really great tool. There are online comic generators that have templates. This is bitstrips.com. And you can create avatars and backgrounds and drag them and position them and put speech bubbles. Completely subjective point is I generally just personally don't like this art style as much. My favorite one recently is from Pixton, Pixton.com, and they just have an incredibly flexible tool, much more usable, I think, and it's just they have a lot of templates you can work from. There's a lot of control over things like hands and arms and things like that. And they do things like if you drag the hand up, the arm moves with it, with the articulation and things like that. So it's a really neat tool for creating comics. So last thing I want to talk about is oftentimes I talk about all this stuff and people go, okay, that's great, but I'm going to get laughed out of the room when I go back and say, hey, I'm thinking of creating these storyboards and these little stick figures to talk about the story. So I just want to give a few tips. First of all, you'd be surprised. I definitely, when I first started out, thought, wow, I'm going to get laughed out of the room. And actually, Yahoo is where we first started doing this, and it went all the way up to VP level people, and all of them want to see more of this because, frankly, it draws attention, and people quickly understand what you're trying to build. It helps people get on the same page, and it quickly allows you to discuss what you're building before you start building it. So you'd be surprised at how few people actually resist this. Regardless, though, some ammunition for you. Consider, again, your audience, who you're talking to. You could go to somebody and somebody might care more about the revenue, and somebody else might care more about the time spent or like what is the point of this. And so you want to know what it is that this person cares about before figuring out how to sell the idea of using storyboards with them. So you could talk about like the resources required. So to create comics, it really does not require that much time. It does not require much expertise. You could do it in days, and it will save you a lot of time in the long run. One of the impetus behind us doing it in the first place was that at one point we started down a path of creating a product, and a month or two into development was when we realized that we were actually on different pages in terms of what we thought the product should be and what it was for. And had we created a much more higher level picture of how people would use the product and who it was for, it would have saved us a lot of backtracking. A lot of people like to have social proof. There are more and more companies that are using comics and storyboards in this manner. So you can say that any of these companies are using them as examples. There's recently a presentation from AirBnB about a project called Snow White, which was used to help define the defining moments of the user journey. eBay uses it in all sorts of ways internally, and even have full-time storyboard communicators on the team. Even Adobe has used it for communicating usability reports. Google for Google Chrome, of course, and it's just being used in a lot of places now. The other thing is its effectiveness. I mentioned about the Raptor comic being used as the the homepage. So at one point, we decided that we would actually try a different homepage, a more traditional carousel, which went through the different features and had screenshots and things like that. And we did an A/B test between the two. They took up the same amount of real estate, and on the right was the sign-up form. And we found the comic converted twice as much as the more traditional carousel in terms of signups. And there's just a lot of research to show that comics are actually much more effective for education, for people remembering what something is about, and you can find a lot of research on this topic. And finally, just how you present it to people matters. So instead of going to somebody and saying, like, do you want to see this comic I made? The biggest detractor of the medium may be yourself. It may be your own insecurity in using this method. And if you believed in it and you backed it, there's a good chance that other people will follow suit. So instead, you're like, I'd like you to review the storyboard for our product concept. So those are some ways that you can potentially use, some tools you can use to sell the method to your organization. The main thing I want to get across, though, is that I don't think of storyboards as a hammer and everything is a nail. Really, to me, this is not a new method. As I said, Hollywood has been using it. You saw an early example of Apple using it years ago. I'm sure other companies you work at use it too. It's more important to me that when you next are thinking of communicating something to somebody, whether it's a customer or somebody internally or a VP or a potential client, it's not that I say you have to use comics and comics are the best way to do it. It's not always the case. But what I would like you to consider is when you think of those things, that you look at storyboards as one more tool in your toolbox. Thank you so much. And I'd love to take some questions now if you have any. And as I said, I'll share the links on the books, but you can also go to this Pinboard URL and you'll see everything from examples out there to resources available, and it's a live updating thing. I keep adding to it.
All right. Well, excellent presentation, Kevin. Thank you so much. We do have quite a few questions here, so we'll take as many as we can. I'll start off with Tony. He would like to know if you use iPad apps for sketching comics. If yes, which ones?
I don't. I played with Paper, which is a fantastic app. And I had a stylus for a while. I don't know what it is. Something about like the palettes and changing things there. Like it just doesn't quite get across the feel that I want to get across that I would with either a sketchbook or a Wacom. But that's really totally a personal thing.
Excellent. A couple people want to know if you draw with software and how do you usually color the comics? So
I draw all the time in meetings on the margins of my paper notes. I think that's been a habit since high school. But for like production things such as the book, a lot of that I drew directly on a Wacom Cintiq monitor, which I really love. I've also used Wacom tablets before. I've drawn in all sorts of software. For the book, I was drawing in Illustrator and coloring in Photoshop. But really, I've also done a lot of like draw it on a piece of paper, take a photo of it, and then that's it. Actually, just one more point about that. Like, for example, on an offsite of my current company, Donna, I had everybody draw, and we just had paper up on a wall, and we drew directly on that with just markers. And I think that's one of the best ways.
Wonderful. Jeff wants to know, how do you know when a comic is effective? How do you know when it could be or might be more effective? To clarify, might it be obvious in some situations and others maybe not? I'd appreciate your view on the topic.
Okay. So in terms of, I think effectiveness is really based on what is your goal. So the big thing you have to determine is what are you trying to achieve with the comic. So for example, the Raptor comic, we knew very clearly it's effective if people sign up. In other things, you want them to understand a story. So the thing you should do is have them read the comic. Right? Have some people beta test it basically. Have some people read the comic, and then have them explain what is happening in that story, and that will help you understand. Like, are they actually understanding the story? Which we've definitely iterated on the comic itself to when we found like, oh, it's not quite getting the point across.
And Diego would like to know, do you know any good software tools for lettering comics?
I just use a font called Digital Script, which is a free one from. If you search for Digital Script font, you'll get it. Letter-O-Matic is another one. Actually, here's a great resource. I just put it into the chat. It's called Blambot. It's all sorts of different. You're gonna explode. It's great.
That's great. Let's see here. Haynes wants to know, I'm curious whether you draw your comments on paper and then scan it, or whether you draw them directly on a laptop. I guess you kind of answered this earlier. But
yeah,
do you use Photoshop or any other software?
I use Photoshop for coloring. I use Illustrator to draw directly on.
All right. And then do you have recommendations on good comics for people who don't usually read them?
Yeah. Wow, lots. I've been some really great like shorts or one-offs. Blankets is a great one, and it's sort of a high school coming of age love story. Another great one is Fun Home, which I think was like a New York Times bestseller. Those are great ones. If you're interested in like zombies, The Walking Dead is much better than the TV series. Like the TV series is basically terrible in comparison. And then there's another one, Persepolis, which is a biographical comic of somebody coming of age in Tehran. Is a great one. There's so many though.
All right. Well, that is it for our event. Do you have any other comments you'd like to leave with the audience?
Feel free to contact me. I'm very accessible. My emails. I'll actually put my email now on the group chat, and you can contact me on Twitter, and I'm happy to recommend more things or answer any questions as you try this out. And I hope you found